So my name is Geraint Johnes. I've done a lot of work on examining issues of efficiency in education. The presentation that I'm giving here looks at efficiency in education, specifically in the context of spatial issues in the UK and the economic development of the Northern Powerhouse.
But the economics of education is something that I've been interested in for a long time, and particularly the interface between the economics of education and labour economics. And a lot of the economics of education is located in that kind of space as a kind of sub-discipline of labour economics. So a lot of what we do in the economics of education is looking at the impact that education has on people's subsequent outcomes in life. And very often those outcomes are examined in terms of the success in the labour market. So how much do people earn, for example, and how are those earnings affected by the education that they've undertaken. And the economics of education is something that has really got a start date. There was a presidential lecture given by the subsequently a Nobel Prize winning economist, Theodore Schultz, in the early 60s, presidential lecture for the American Economic Association. And he had been a development economist up to that point. He'd studied a lot of things to do with productivity in agriculture in developing countries. And one of the things that he'd found was that better educated and better trained farmers were more productive. And because they were more productive, they earned more. And from that, he developed the idea of education as an investment not in machinery or physical capital, but an investment in human capital. So education essentially is something that we bolt on to our heads. You know, you get 3 years of education in economics at Cambridge. It's like having a machine stuck to your head that makes you more productive and hopefully then enables you to earn more. And so Schultz's insight was that you could examine education and investments in education in much the same way as you can examine investments in physical capital. And you have to discount future returns in order to put everything on a level playing field, and people will then invest in education if the discounted value of future returns to the education offsets the cost, the instantaneous cost of education. And from that there came a huge literature, Gary Becker from Chicago, Jake Mincer, and there have been thousands of studies that have looked at the economic return to education. So that's one big chunk of the economics of education. There's two approaches to this that have been taken in the literature. One's the human capital approach that Schultz initiated, but then in the 1970s, Spence came up with the idea that rather than education augmenting people's human capital, it could be that it just flags particular talent. Okay, so education may be a signal of people who've got terrific innate ability, and it may be cheaper in some sense for people like those of us in this room to invest in education to a high degree because you find it easy or whatever. You find it cheaper than it is for other people who don't get as much education as we do. And so the more educated provide a signal of their greater innate ability. So there are these two competing explanations of what's going on between education and the labour market. First of all, education as a productivity enhancer. Okay, education enhances our human capital, and so we get more educated people getting higher earnings because they've augmented their stock of human capital. Actually, education has contributed to their productivity. The other approach, signalling and screening, is saying that more educated people have more innate ability, and all the education is doing is signalling the fact that they have more innate ability. So those of you that are into the theory of all this will recognize that if the if the brighter people are going to invest more in their education so that their education serves as a signal in the labour market, then you need to get a separating equilibrium that makes sure that less bright people don't invest in their education, brighter people do invest in their education. So there's a whole literature surrounding the distinction between a separating equilibrium that ensures that that happens and a pooling equilibrium where that's all screwed up and it doesn't work. So they're major bits of the economics of education, but there are also a lot of areas of the economics of education that come out of education really being a good lab in which to conduct applied work. So we've got a lot of stuff that has been done recently, for example, on school choice. Okay, so school choice is essentially it's like a lab to say, does a liberal approach to allowing people to choose result in better outcomes? Okay, so if you have free school choice, or if you've got a voucher system that allows people to spend a voucher in whatever school they want, whether it's a state school or a private school, okay, does that enhance outcomes? So I've done some work with co-authors in that. There's also work that's being done now on lotteries for deciding which school people end up going to. So some areas within Britain, Brighton operates a lottery. So instead of schools having catchment areas, particularly popular schools allocate their places according to some kind of lottery. There are various kinds of lottery design that can be used, and economists look at how effective each of those designs can be. So that's another area. The area where I've done most work is looking at the efficiency of educational institutions, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in some of the presentation once we get the slides going. I'll talk a little bit about the work that I've done around efficiency. And this is really, I call it the economics of education, but it's a little bit of a con because all I'm doing is using data from the education industry in order to examine an issue, the issue of efficiency. Anyway, we'll get on with the paper and you'll see what it is that I've been doing. I'm particularly pleased to come here because I've got a favour to ask you. All right? I like, in my presentations, as you'll see, to put some pictures in. And whenever I reference somebody, I like to put a picture of them in. But there is one guy I have completely failed to get a picture of. And it really bugs me because I cite his work a lot. And you can help me because this guy was at Cambridge. So there's an absolutely seminal piece of work on efficiency that was published in 1958 in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society by a guy called Mike Farrell. And Farrell was at Cambridge, and I have failed to get a photo of him. I do know he died young, but I would have imagined that somewhere in Cambridge there would be a picture of him. One of my colleagues at Lancaster was supervised by him for his PhD, and he hasn't managed to unearth a photo of him either. So if any of you can get a picture of Mike Farrell, please send it to me. Okay, so I'm going to have to keep looking, right? So efficiency in lower and upper higher secondary education and implications for the Northern Powerhouse. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Since most of you are Brits, you'll know this guy, Evan Davis. Yes? Probably best known at the moment as the main presenter of Newsnight, but he's been a TV journalist for many years. Those of you who've done anything in regional economics may have come across the hotelling model, or those of you doing industrial organisation may have seen the hotelling model. I really, really admire Evan Davis because on the main evening news bulletin on the BBC, the 10 o'clock news bulletin, he once explained the hotelling model. That is just mind-boggling that a journalist can do that on a TV news show. But Evan Davis had a short series of two TV programs, two one-hour TV programs in 2014, and it was about London versus the rest of the country. And he came up with a rather wacky idea in this mini-series, and that idea was that the second city of the UK ought to be Hebden Bridge. Does anybody know Hebden Bridge? Is anybody from Hebden Bridge? You're from near Haworth? Okay, so I'd better not be too insulting about Hebden Bridge. But that is Hebden Bridge. Okay, it does not look as though it could be a candidate for the second city of the UK. It barely qualifies as a town in terms of its population. It's a pretty small place, bless you. And you can see it's surrounded by, on a sunny day it's very attractive, on a rainy day it's pretty miserable. It's surrounded by these moorlands. But it's small. It is located, you can't see the map, it's located, if you think of a triangle between Manchester, think of a line between Manchester and Leeds. It's about halfway along and slightly north of that. So it's really not terribly accessible. Okay? If you think of a triangle between Manchester, Leeds and Haworth, then it'd be in the middle of that. Yeah, so yeah, it's near Halifax, if that means anything to anyone. Okay, so Hebden Bridge. So what the hell was Evan Davis going on about Hebden Bridge being the second city? Well, essentially, I've got a video. Can we play this? This is going to be really challenging. This is a bit from. Can we get it to work? Oops. Oh. It might hiccup.
Cannot play media.
No, can't play video. Okay. The video is going to show you a little clip from the TV program, and basically the idea here was that they're interviewing a guy in a pub, and the guy's talking about how Hebden Bridge is essentially an inverted city. Normally in a city you've got a lot of people there during the daytime, and at night people go out to the suburbs. But Hebden Bridge is the opposite. Hebden Bridge is the place that people go out to. And then people pour into not one city, but Leeds, Sheffield, Manchester, Liverpool. And if you look at there's some graphics in the video that show how the nighttime population of the centres of Liverpool, Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, the nighttime population goes down as people move out into the suburbs. So you've got essentially an inverted city somewhere like Hebden Bridge, and Hebden Bridge is right at the middle of this. Okay, so if you think of those four cities, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, do I have to say Bradford? No. One or two other places. All right, think of those as being surrounding. Yeah, Hebden Bridge is in the middle, and it looks like an empty place because the population isn't huge, but it's actually the city centre of this great northern city that doesn't exist because we've got various names for the various bits of it. Okay, but it's in effect a city that it's a latent city. Then a few months after Evan Davis broadcast this show, George Osborne who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, of course, came out with the idea of creating a northern powerhouse out of these cities. And there is an intellectual kind of backup to this. You know, that came out of what Evan Davis was doing initially. But the intellectual background and underpinning is really one that starts out in the field of linguistics. I don't know if anybody here studies linguistics as a minor or anything, but linguistics is a fascinating subject. And what this guy, George Zipf, came up with was an analysis of the frequency with which different words appear in language. So if you look at the English language, the is the most frequent word. Okay, I don't know what the second most frequent word is. But if you look at the distribution of the first most frequent word, the second most frequently used word, third most frequently, there's a regular distribution. And that's a regular distribution across all languages. Okay, and this came to be known as Zipf's distribution. Okay, so you know, the is used twice as often as the second most frequent word, which is used twice as often as the third most, and so on as you go through. And after Zipf created this Zipf's law, people in different disciplines started to notice that Zipf's law applied in a bunch of different contexts. And one of the contexts it applies in is to do with city size. And if you look at the size of cities within countries, in most countries, city size follows Zipf's law. So if you look at Paris and Marseille, for example, in France, Berlin and I can't remember, I think it's Hamburg in Germany. If you look at Sao Paulo and Rio in Brazil, New York and LA in America, then they all have this characteristic that the largest city is about twice the size of the second largest city. But that's not the case in the UK. Okay, so you've got London as the largest city, and Birmingham and Manchester, Birmingham's a little bit bigger than Manchester, but not hugely so, are way lower than London. So London's around 8 million, and they're around about, they're either side of 2 million. Okay, so the second city in the UK, so it is argued, is too small. And we could benefit by having a second city that was larger. So, extending this a little bit further, if you look at some elasticities, you can look at the literature on productivity and the elasticity of productivity with respect to city size. And I was looking recently at a meta-analysis of these, and the typical elasticity was coming out to be 0.05. Okay, so that means that if you've got a bigger city, then that will, if you have a 10% increase in city size, then that will lead to a 0.5% increase in productivity. Okay, so there are appreciable productivity effects of agglomeration. Now, one of my colleagues at Lancaster, Dakshina De Silva, does some work on this, and he finds that the agglomeration you've got to have has to be extremely tight, you know, within a couple of miles. Once you go beyond a couple of miles, agglomeration benefits tend to peter out. So it really does depend on having coffee with people rather than, you know, being within 10 miles to have a meeting. If you look then at what would happen if you abolished Liverpool, Sheffield and Leeds and absorbed them within a super Manchester. In other words, you create one big city of around 7 million people out of the existing cities, then potentially you could add around 1% onto the national GDP forever, right? Just by making these places operate as one big city instead of separate places, which is a typical George Osborne thing to have come up with. I mean, George Osborne was brilliant at pulling rabbits out of hats, and this is really a pulling rabbit out of a hat kind of thing to do. Difficult to do because the history gets in the way. All right, the Manchester has docks. It has docks because it's got a ship canal that joins Manchester to the sea near Liverpool. You look at, it's actually the longest canal in the world. It's slightly longer than the Panama Canal. Huge engineering achievement done at the end of the 19th century. Why was it done? It was done because the dock owners in Liverpool were charging exorbitant rates for Manchester businesses to use Liverpool's docks. So Liverpool and Manchester basically hate each other, and you see that in football now. So there's that kind of civic rivalry to overcome. You've also got a whole bunch of mountains in between Manchester on the one hand and Leeds and Sheffield on the other, because the spine of England, the Pennines, goes right down the middle. And that has meant that transport links are not great. Okay, so there's a lot to be overcome in creating a Northern Powerhouse, history, geography. But the aim of it is to get these kind of agglomeration economies. And the next slide is to do with journey times. You've no hope at the back of seeing these, have you? But it's all about journey times by rail from Liverpool to Manchester Airport, to Sheffield, to Leeds. In an extreme case, Newcastle. Okay, the government has been very ambivalent about what the Northern Powerhouse actually is. Sometimes it includes Newcastle and Hull, other times it doesn't. And I think that's weakened the proposition of the Northern Powerhouse, actually. But the aim is to get journey times down. So between Liverpool and Manchester to 20 minutes, between Manchester and Leeds to 30 minutes, Manchester, Sheffield to 30 minutes, and Sheffield to Leeds to 30 minutes. Now it takes forever to get between any of these places, and you just wouldn't want to do it by train. The rail connections there are appalling. So there's a lot of investment already going into that. I've got some headlines here. The possibility of building High Speed 3, which would link Manchester to Leeds and potentially be wider than that, going east-west. The possibility of building a new tunnel through the Pennines, a road tunnel to join Manchester and Sheffield. The only routes that you've got at the moment that join Manchester and Sheffield have to close for a while during the winter if it snows. Okay, so you've got to go a long way around. And already opened, there's a massive extension to the docks in Liverpool. So there's a lot of investment already going into transport. But the thing that's really missing there is education. Okay, we can get improved transport, making these places act more like one city. But there's a lot of evidence that these places have been educational cold spots. And a major challenge that faces the Northern Powerhouse is to ensure that graduates remain there, if they're already there, or are attracted there, in order to make this an engine for growth. So there's a lot of solutions that are out there already for transport, but education is something that has been under-examined up till now. I should have asked, how long do you want me to go on for?
Another 20 minutes.
Another 20 minutes, okay. So I'll say a little bit about my own involvement in the economics of education and in looking at efficiency. I'll have to catch sight of the screen in order to remind myself. So some early papers that I did used some of the methods of analysing efficiency to look at the research efficiency of universities in the UK. So there are a lot of performance indicators like the Research Excellence Framework that we've got now. There was a lot of talk in the early days of these performance indicators of looking at the number of books that were published, the number of articles that were published, where they were published. And I did some analyses looking at how we can use efficiency modelling techniques in order to examine these and how stable the rankings were. I ought to say something about what happened after Farrell. I have technology. So Farrell basically looked at efficiency through looking at a bunch of ratios. Okay, so if you're into accounting, the kind of accounting ratios that you've got that look at the performance of firms, Farrell developed a lot of those. Then in the late 1970s, there were two bits of literature that concern efficiency that developed. One of them was developed by management scientists or operational research people, who were into linear programming. And they developed a technique that's known as data envelopment analysis, or DEA. And you can represent DEA graphically, very simply, by looking at a graph where we've got output measured along the vertical axis, input along the horizontal axis, and you get data on output and input for various firms, or in our case, various educational institutions. Okay, so you may have one school here, one school there, one school here, one school here, and you can draw a piecewise linear frontier that says, okay, if you look at inputs and outputs, then these are in some sense efficient relative certainly to this one. Okay, if you were to stand at the origin here and throw a rope around these pegs, then you'd get a frontier that looked something like that. Yeah? And so you can say that these three are candidates for being efficient. They're on an efficiency frontier. This should also be an output. Okay, we've got two outputs, output 1 and output 2. So these three are candidates for being efficient. This one produces a lot of output 1, doesn't produce very much output 2. This one produces a lot of output 2, not very much output 1. This one's somewhere in the middle. Unless you've got a strong preference for one of the outputs, you can't judge between those three. Okay? But this one, you can say that this school is less efficient than the others. And you can draw a ray from the origin out to the frontier and say, okay, if the ratio of this to this gives you a measure of how efficient that school is. Okay, so that's the approach taken by linear programming people, and you can do this with many inputs, many outputs. It's an attractive technique because multiple inputs, multiple outputs can be used. The other technique that was developed by economists, econometricians, statisticians, and it's known as stochastic frontier analysis. And this looks at, again, comparing inputs and outputs. You may have inputs here which we can measure as, say, costs, the costs of producing something. And you've got output along here. And you've got a scatter diagram through which ordinarily you'd put a line of best fit. Yeah? As economists, you see a scatter diagram like that, you want to put a line of best fit through it. The idea of stochastic frontier analysis is that you don't put a line of best fit because if you want to estimate a cost function, what you want to know is at how low a cost can something efficiently be produced. Okay, so instead of a line of best fit, you put a line that's down here somewhere. The line of best fit might be up here, but the line that you plot is here. And you do that by saying, okay, the regression line is going to have the residual, as usual, but it's also got another component to the residual, an asymmetric component to the residual. And the asymmetric component to the residual represents inefficiency. So you can start to interpret these gaps here as being measures of inefficiency. So both these approaches, DEA and SFA, were developed following the work that Farrell did in the 1950s, but they're things that I've used in the context of the economics of education. Okay? So I'll run through this quite quickly. Statistical cost function, various papers I've done using that, using stochastic frontier, and also I've done some methodological developments in data envelopment analysis in particular. So I'll skip through this quite quickly. Network DEA is an interesting innovation where instead of looking at inputs and outputs and saying, okay, these are the outputs of a black box production technique, these are the inputs, you actually start to open up the black box and you measure the efficiency of different stages of production. Okay, and that's what I'm going to be looking at as we go through here. So I develop a network. In the study that I'm reporting on here, there are two separate networks that I developed. This is the first, where we're looking at secondary schools, and we've got the numbers of students, numbers of teachers. They produce GCSE results, okay, so exam results at age 16. They then provide an input into what goes on in upper secondary education as students study for their A-levels, and you may get entrants from other schools coming into the school in sixth form as well. Okay, so this is a network because this is an intermediate output. GCSE results are an intermediate output that can then be used as an input into what goes on in upper secondary education. Okay, so I'm able to estimate what efficiency is here at the first node and at the final node. So that's a simple model. A little bit more realistically, we can look at more inputs into the school system. So we've got here the number of teachers, the number of students who are on free school meals, number of students who are not on free school meals, and the salary bill. Okay, so here we're looking at some qualitative aspects, both of the pupils. If you've got more that are on free school meals, then you've got a more socially deprived area. And also of the teachers, because if you've got more expensive teachers, the salary bill will be higher, but presumably there is a reason why they are more expensive. Okay, so 4 separate inputs into GCSE results. You've also then got entrants from other schools coming in to influence A-level results. But we've got 2 other outputs coming in here. So GCSE results are a good thing, but how do they impact on kids going on to study A levels, or, and now I'm looking at these as positive outcomes, kids going into apprenticeships or kids going into further education. Okay, so more outputs being regarded as positive in the second model that we've got there. And the data that I use come from the secondary school performance league tables. And I've looked at data for those that are doing GCSEs in 2013 and so A-levels in 2015. So there's about 1,500 schools involved in this. And I've analysed it using data envelopment analysis. So it's using linear programming methods tailored so that you can analyse it in this network format. Okay. So the problem with data envelopment analysis is how do you interpret the results? And I like to interpret these results by looking at some maps. And this is really bad because you're not going to be able to see it. But basically, and I'm running a little bit short of time as well, I'm conscious of this. Basically, the story is that you get some red bits around Manchester, Liverpool. You get some red bits elsewhere as well, but you get a lot of red bits in the Northern Powerhouse when you are analysing the basic DEA model. Okay, so if you regard GCSE results as the only results that matter at age 16, and you regard progression into A-level as being important, then the Northern Powerhouse didn't do terribly well. Okay? So that's the first thing to come out of this analysis. If you look at the more sophisticated model, the full model, where are we? Full model, then the Northern Powerhouse does okay. So there aren't any red bits in Manchester and Liverpool and so on. So it seems that what's going on at age 16 is that schools in the Northern Powerhouse are being pretty successful at age 16, but they're successful at getting their kids into apprenticeships and into further education rather than continuing in school to go on to do A-level. Okay? And if we look specifically at what goes on in the second node, the A-level node, then again we've got some red bits coming through in the Northern Powerhouse. So at upper secondary level in the Northern Powerhouse, you've got some problems with schools converting the kids that do stay in the schools into kids with good A-level results. Okay, so that's really the story that we've got here. Got some distributions to show you. I'm on figure 9. This is the distribution of the efficiency of secondary schools, overall efficiency, using the full model. And it looks as though, broadly speaking, schools are pretty efficient. This is kind of how long is a piece of string problem here, you know, how efficient is efficient. But the distribution's bunched around full efficiency. Okay? But if you split it into the two nodes, then you can see that node 1, GCSE, schools are pretty efficient, but at upper secondary education, the efficiency levels are really bunched around a pretty low score. So schools, this is across the country, schools are pretty good at producing GCSE results, getting their kids either to carry on into upper secondary education or go into further education or go into apprenticeships. Schools are pretty good at that. At upper secondary, given the kids that are coming through, they're not so good at getting the A-level results. Okay? And similar findings if you aggregate up to local authority level. Some scatter plots. This is from the basic model. There's quite a strong positive correlation between efficiency at node 1 and efficiency at node 2. And this is the irresistible bit. I had to do a regression. Okay. This is a regression of efficiency at node 1, age 16, against the size of the school, the unemployment rate of the local authority that it's in, and a dummy variable for if you're in the Northern Powerhouse or not. At age 16, node 1, there's no effects, nothing significant. At age 18, everything's significant. So big schools perform better. Schools that are in local authorities with a high rate of unemployment perform worse. And schools that are in the Northern Powerhouse perform significantly worse than schools elsewhere. So there seems to be a problem. It seems to be a problem that is to do with what the destination is at age 16 and a problem with how well upper secondary education works in the Northern Powerhouse. So that's it. Thank you. Questions? That's my Twitter handle. And if you go onto my Twitter, you'll be able to see what I was doing last night.
What was that?
I'm not going to tell you. You can go onto my Twitter. But I found it really exciting.
Well,
Thanks.
Thank you so much for coming. It was a total pleasure, and I'm super sorry for how it turned out. But I think we still had all a great time, and if you have any questions, I think he'll be more than happy to answer any.
I was wondering how do we solve this? Effectively, I know it's a massive question, but I feel like these problems are endemic, and I don't think throwing the whole idea of an Northern Powerhouse is effectively throw money at the North. And if you invest in the North, then you'll get economic growth out of it. But how do you solve these problems?
That is a really good, and it's a good question and a very difficult one to answer. I think first of all, getting a more refined handle on what the nature of the problem is. And Osborne was good at pulling rabbits out of the hat, and he wasn't going to throw money at the North. You know, a lot of people. I did a session on the Northern Powerhouse with our local MP, and she was dreadful. You know, it was all, well, we've got to get more money. And you know, sorry, you're not going to get it. You know, and the whole point of the Northern Powerhouse was to have a proposition that would say there is a return associated with doing all this agglomeration activity, and we can pay back investors out of what that return is. So they've attracted Chinese investment in housing, for example, on the back of that. In terms of education, the serious problem is that you can educate people, but they won't stay. But I do think that breaking it up, looking inside the black box and seeing exactly where the problems are might be a place that we can start. So if schools in the North have been particularly good at sending kids into apprenticeships, but not so good at sending kids into upper secondary, then is that something that we need to address? And how do we address that? What do we do within the schools to encourage more kids to go on into upper secondary? It doesn't solve the problem of London as a magnet for graduates.
And obviously a lot of the thing about education is obviously it's a very sort of cultural and sociological aspect in the sense that if for the last 50 years the North has been focused towards jobs that are no longer there, but obviously 30, 40 years ago there were jobs in manufacturing and industry that were there in which an apprenticeship would set you up and you wouldn't need to go on to higher education. How do you, that's just impossible to effectively, I don't know, but I feel like in the South it's way more the sense that there are jobs that are out there for you that require levels, that require university education, so you do that because the incentive is there, but obviously you're saying the issue is that graduates aren't staying in the North because there are no jobs there. And is it
Well-
just like one massive cycle effectively?
Well, maybe there, the investments that are taking place in transport could help, and making it a bigger conurbation that includes all these cities may give the opportunities for people, and they may see, okay, if it's possible to commute from Liverpool to Manchester in 30 minutes, then it becomes realistic for Liverpudlians to work in Manchester, if you can get over the cultural issues. So yeah, I mean, there are huge challenges, but certainly having more opportunities within range may make it more attractive for people to stay in education, because there are greater opportunities within that wider radius.
Yeah, do you think there's like a sort of scope for thinking of sort of attaining like variance in like when you're measuring efficiency? Just because I've seen like lots of statistics about grammar schools, and they're like, yes, the mean achievement is higher. Actually, in those areas, like the variance is much more different, and usually that kind of cancels out the effect nationally. And I don't know if there's like an objective way to think of if education is better when the average grades are higher, or if like the variance is smaller. Well, there's like benefits to having a smaller variance, and there's benefits to having a higher variance. I don't know.
Yeah, I usually prefer to work with data that are as granular as possible. I mean, the data that I've got here are down to school level, but they don't go down to pupil level within the school. And that may well be the obvious next step. You know, we've got the National Pupil Database that can be used to, it's actually the underpinnings of the data that I've used here. So going down to that level, looking at this all at pupil level, would allow me to get a handle on the distribution of abilities performance within schools as well as across schools. So that's a good suggestion.
With regards to Brexit, do you think that there ought to be more, now London might not be such a big focus anymore, that maybe in terms of looking at British industry, the Northern Powerhouse might receive more investment from British firms, sort of having to focus more on the within Britain border and not so much into exporting to Europe anymore?
I could say anything I don't need to. Do you know something the rest of us don't know about what
No, I'm
Brexit's
just
going to look
asking
like?
whether, that in terms of asking the question, how do we get more focus on away from London and onto other cities? Are you optimistic about how sort of sentiments are shifting within Britain with regards to promoting the Northern Powerhouse, or do you not really see that making an awful big difference?
I'm not optimistic about very much about this country at the moment. If you want to look for sources of optimism, pretty clearly the governing elite has not appreciated the extent to which other people have fallen behind and felt disenfranchised as a consequence. And there may be some shock value in that. And that might mean that there is more thinking, there will have to be more thinking in the future about distributional aspects of policy. So, you look at this paper that came out last week, an academic paper, looking at the distributional impact of policy over the last 7 years, since 2010, across OECD countries. And the UK was very distinctive in having hit the poorest deciles hardest. Now, I think governments looking forward are going to have to reassess that because of the political ramifications that it's had. be some good news there for the poorer communities in the Northern Powerhouse and the poorer communities everywhere.
On that sort of note, do you realistically, in like the next 50 years, do you see the Northern Powerhouse actually? Do you actually think they'll?
Do I actually believe in the Northern
Yeah, will
Powerhouse?
there be some tangible investment in the Northern anyway?
The Northern Powerhouse was very much George Osborne's baby, and Theresa May didn't get on with George Osborne, and it's kind of, to some extent, fallen out of the government's vocabulary. They've started talking about the Midlands engine. And, well, you would, wouldn't you? You know that the people in the Midlands are going to be a bit peeved that Manchester was picked as the sort of locus for this rather than Birmingham. And so there are political things there. But the whole Zipf's law thing says that, you know, you can't have a powerhouse everywhere. It stops being a meaningful thing. So whether this survives or not, I don't know. There was a lot of hunger for it, certainly in the north, and a lot of local authorities of Greater Manchester Council. And a lot of these were the first to get the mayor status. Okay. So there's a lot of energy behind it, and it's also straddled the left-right political spectrum things. So Labour areas have worked with the Conservative central government in order to mobilise it. There's a lot of investment gone into transport infrastructure in the north, so that has been committed. There's Chinese money that has come in, but whether it survives, I really don't know. I guess what I'm saying is that it's got to be more than the transport as well.
I have a question on that. So if we pinpoint these sources within the education process, and we all know how important education is, we take it for granted sometimes and we value it very much. But how do we then inform the debates on education by using these marvelous insights you gave us and say, hey, this is really an issue. These things not being able to transfer from node 1 to node 2 have issues. They materialize in issues in these certain areas. How do we make this link and make this link then count?
I don't think I've got an insight that isn't already out there. In the sense that there is a recognition that there's an educational deficit in that region. And I can't remember when this, I think it was when Osborne still was Chancellor of the Exchequer. There was a very successful head of a chain of academies in Bradford was asked to report on education in the north. Now, I've not seen what's come out of that. I don't think anything has come out of it yet. But it is a live issue. How we can improve education, specifically in the Northern Powerhouse, but across the country.
And also, if the Northern Powerhouse is so good at producing output until this stage at node 1, why not capitalize on this? Why not say, let's transform it to this model that has been working in the South? Why not say, yes, we have this very good output that goes into apprenticeships. Why not capitalize on this?
Because it's not necessarily what the North should be focusing on. I mean, certainly, if you include those outputs at the end of lower secondary education, going into apprenticeships, going into further education, if you include those as positive outputs, then all the schools seem to be doing well. But it seems to be that they are doing badly if you only look at the transfer from lower secondary into upper secondary. They're doing badly in that because they're doing well in the apprenticeships. Okay. Now, if the aim of the education system is to improve numbers going through into upper secondary, then you've got to say to these schools, okay, you know, recognise that you've been doing well. It's not that you're basket cases. It's not that you're hopeless at doing everything, but maybe you should be diverting some of your energies that you're using very well here into this. Okay.
Thanks. Are there any more questions? Well, thank you so much for
Thank
this
you.
talk.
Good discussion.